Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. All right, everybody. I am back. Good to be back. Final segment of the show, so good to be back. And I do want to wrap up with really a story that kind of sort of is related to the last segment that we just did on the Big 12 and the Pac-12, and that is the present and future of Notre Dame football. Because on Monday night, a story came out that rocked the world of all of college football. Except if you listen to the Aaron Torres Sports Podcast, it really wasn't all that surprising at all because we talked about it and I gave you a dollar figure almost identical to what came out on Monday night. But let's talk about it. Let's discuss. Let's debate. Because right now we all know, obviously, the talk of college sports is realignment. And the next big domino, or the single biggest domino left, I don't know if it's the next one, but it's certainly the biggest one, is Notre Dame. They could join the Big Ten. They could join, if they decide they want to join the SEC, Greg Sankey would take them in a heartbeat. But they also, of course, are currently an independent, and I think most people kind of understand they probably want to remain an independent if they can. Well, on Monday night, Dennis Dodd from CBS put out a report that shook up the internet in terms of what it's going to take for NBC to keep their contract with Notre Dame beyond 2025 and to keep Notre Dame an independent. That dollar figure, it was, drumroll please, $75 million. That is what Notre Dame wants, $75 million per year to remain independent and to have all of its home games exclusively on NBC. And when that number came out on Monday, it shocked the world. The internet went crazy. There were women fainting in the streets and children running around like the fire hose had just blown up and there was water flowing everywhere. I'm making stuff up. The point that I'm trying to make is everybody went crazy, but as I told you last segment, this is why you listen to the Aaron Torres Sports Podcast. We talked about this about 2 weeks ago, and I said at the time, as we were trying to figure out in the days immediately following the USC-UCLA to the Big Ten news, what was going to happen next, what did I say was the first thing I would do if I was a TV exec? I said if I was at NBC, I would go to Notre Dame, rip up the current TV contract, and hand them a brand new one. And I believe the dollar amount that I gave, it might not have been exactly $75 million, but it was right around $75 million. That is why you listen to this show, because I told you this was going to happen. So the question now becomes, one, why that number isn't crazy, and two, why did I tell you 2 weeks ago it was going to happen? Well, to quote my old buddy J.J. Redick, and excuse my language, this is J.J. Redick's words, not mine, it's a simple math equation, F-head, and I'm not going to use his terms because there might be children in the car or children around. It is a simple math equation, F-head. And so why the $75 million number makes perfect sense now, why I said it made perfect sense 2 weeks ago, is because, again, it is a simple math equation. Notre Dame is obviously right now an independent through 2025 with all of their home games on NBC Sports. We talked about it, we discussed it, and one thing that I said 2 weeks ago when I first started looking into this, I think we all kind of have this idea that Notre Dame has this incredible sweetheart deal with NBC Sports, with NBC. All their home games nationally televised every single week. And I think when they signed it, it probably was a sweetheart deal. But I looked at the numbers and I was blown away. Here is how much NBC currently pays Notre Dame for their 7 to 8 home football games a year. They currently pay Notre Dame $15 million a year. Now, Dennis Dodd said it's an average of $15 million. It's probably closer on the back end of the contract to $22 million. It is a backloaded contract. But $15 million to $22 million, and even when you factor in that Notre Dame gets another $10 million or so from the ACC as part of, obviously, Notre Dame has its non-football sports tied to the ACC. That sounds like a lot of money, right? That sounds great. $32 million, the $22 million that NBC pays for football, the $10 million that the ACC pays, $32 million a year for one athletic department. That's incredible money. Except if you follow the math and you follow the numbers, and what do they always say? Follow the money. That money might have been good 10 years ago when Notre Dame signed the contract. It might have even been good 5 years ago. It might have even been good 3 years ago. But the market has changed, and remember, why did USC and UCLA go to Notre Dame, or why did they go to the Big Ten in the first place? The reason USC and UCLA went to the Big Ten, I keep wanting to say the Pac-12, that's where they were, they're going to the Big Ten now. The reason they went to the Big Ten is because the money was through the roof. The money for the Big Ten TV contract is going to be around $75 million per year for everybody in the Big Ten. Not just Ohio State, not just Michigan, not just Penn State. Rutgers is going to make $75 million a year in TV money for their athletic department. Minnesota is going to make $75 million per year for their athletic department just from their TV contract. Northwestern just built one of the nicest football facilities in America 3-4 years ago. Based on the TV money that they get, now they're going to get more, $75 million. And so to go back to the J.J. Redick, it's a simple math equation, F-head. Notre Dame right now making $32 or so million a year. That is half to 60% less than what everybody in the Big Ten is getting. And so, of course, they can't stay under this current contract. Of course, it needs to be ripped up. And now I think the fascinating question becomes what happens next. Now, what could potentially happen next is really interesting, and Dennis Dodd actually put in one little piece of news that I had not heard before, but I do think it is interesting to this conversation. It seems as though NBC is willing to give Notre Dame big money. But one thing that NBC wants, and it's not even necessarily a Notre Dame thing, but they want what Dennis Dodd is calling shoulder programming around Notre Dame football. What does that mean? It means that they want to find some other football, college football somewhere on Saturdays that they can put before Notre Dame games and after Notre Dame games. They don't just want you tuning into NBC like we do now. Let's be honest. You tune in 10 minutes before the Notre Dame game, and the second that game ends, you tune the heck right out and go to the next game. They want to put something else on NBC or wherever they're broadcasting, and I'm sure they're going to have some of these games on their apps, whatever. They want shoulder programming around Notre Dame football so it becomes an experience. The same way that you turn on Fox for Big Noon, and then you keep it on for that Big 12 game, and then you keep it on at night for another game. The way that you turn on ESPN at 12 noon for whatever game and you're on till 7, and then you get the SEC game, and then you get that Pac-12 After Dark game. That's what NBC wants to create. And so in terms of what could potentially happen next for Notre Dame, that's what I think you have to watch out for. Not only what could happen with Notre Dame, but is NBC actively pursuing other conferences, other schools, other ways to put programming around Notre Dame? Now, beyond that, I think the other interesting thing is what could potentially happen next and what is the time frame? That, to me, is something else that's fascinating here as well. I saw Dennis Dodd say that he believes that this could all get figured out in the next 2 to 3 weeks. I don't really buy that, and Dennis Dodd's a good reporter. I think he actually came on this podcast once, like episode 2, which I don't even think he can find access to anymore. Dennis Dodd's a great reporter. I don't see the 2 to 3 weeks narrative for a couple reasons. One, NBC's got to figure out what that shoulder programming is, what's available, how much we have to pay. But two, I think Notre Dame could take their sweet time. If NBC's not going to commit without getting other games around Notre Dame, then I don't know why Notre Dame is in a rush to commit either. Now, if NBC just says, let's extend this thing out, $75 million a year, I think Notre Dame signs tomorrow. But I think NBC, it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing. NBC won't give that contract until they obviously have other games around Notre Dame. And because of it, I don't think Notre Dame has to rush either. And that's the important thing here. And I'm talking too much about other games because this is about Notre Dame. And I would say one thing specifically about Notre Dame and all this stuff. And that's this, is that what I would say is Notre Dame completely holds all the cards in all of this, and they don't have to take some lowball offer. I think that's an important part of this as well. So why might this not get done in a quick amount of time? One, because NBC has to figure out what the heck they're going to do around Notre Dame football. But two, you can't lowball Notre Dame because Notre Dame has more options than anybody right now anywhere. I think if it's up to them, they would love to remain independent, but they're not going to do it at a discount rate because, again, think about if Notre Dame is making significantly less money then say Ohio State, then say Michigan, then say Alabama, Georgia, Texas, Texas A&M, and the SEC. Then at a certain point, you're going to fall behind, and that is why they can't take a low ball deal. They also know they got plenty of options, too. I think if they want to remain independent, that's where it gets a little bit dicey. If NBC just says, you know what, we're out of the college football game, we can't afford this. Trey Wallace actually said it on this show a few weeks ago. He said NBC might just decide, you know what, we have the number one show in America, Sunday Night NFL Football. We're just getting out of the college football game. Then it gets interesting because I do think maybe would CBS be interested? Remember, CBS, of course, does not right now, as of this moment, have any real college football once they lose the SEC in a couple years. If not, Fox obviously would be willing to pay good money, but they probably want them to go to the Big Ten. ESPN would probably pay good money, but they would want them to go to the SEC. So this is going to be something really, really interesting to follow. But I think the one thing that I get the sense of, I don't think there's any rush from Notre Dame's perspective. They don't have to take a bad offer. They can work with NBC if they want to work with NBC to figure out what that shoulder programming is. But they seem to have all of the control in this whole scenario. But it's something to keep an eye on. It's certainly interesting. The one thing I would say is this. If you listen to this podcast, it should not come as a surprise to you that they want $75 million. And by the way, I'll say this. I don't think it's a crazy number at all. I think all they're saying to NBC is, look, you want all this exclusivity. That's fine. But you got to put us on an even playing field as Rutgers, as Ohio State, as Michigan, as Alabama, as Georgia, as Florida, as LSU. We don't mind. I think Notre Dame, if they had their druthers, would prefer to be independent. But it can't come at a cost. It can't put their football program behind everybody else. And, oh, by the way, it's going to put all their other athletic programs behind everybody else as well because they'll be making significantly less money. So it's something to keep an eye on. It was an interesting report. I will say I don't really see the scenario where there is a big rush. This is something I think, look, could it be resolved in a couple weeks? Could NBC figure this out in a couple weeks? Yeah, but Notre Dame's got till 2025 under their current TV deal. So I think they can wait, they can be patient, they can see what options are out there. If Notre Dame or if NBC tries to lowball them, I think they could go to Fox and say, hey, let's start this conversation about joining the Big Ten. They could go to ESPN and say, hey, let's start this conversation about joining the SEC. There's already a report that, the Big 12 is going to try to woo them. But the bottom line is Notre Dame's getting paid one way or the other. And they kind of put they kind of turned the screws to NBC this week. I'm not surprised at all. If you listen to this podcast, you are not surprised at all either. All right, I think that's it for this episode of the Aaron Torres Sports Podcast. Great show, man. I'll say this. We're really, 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 I think, starting to hit a groove, and we're really, really, really starting to ramp up. And I really, really, really appreciate your guys' support. It's been fun. It's great to be back. I've gotten a lot of messages privately how nice it is to hear me kind of in my element doing AT things, getting all fired up about random things. It was fun last week to do the long-form interviews, but it is a lot of fun to get back and really just talk about the things that not only that I care about, but that I believe that you all care about as well.